So just before we jump into Stephen Bradshaw's evidence, there was an interesting update from Sir Wyn on the 11th of January 2024, so about 3/4 of the way-ish through phase 4. In fact, it might have been even a little bit further than that. But in any case, highlighting, I think, some answers to one of the most commonly asked questions that I get. Why is the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry taking so long? I think one of the things it highlights is the issues with disclosure that the inquiry are having. So we'll listen to Sir Wyn's words on that, but also the efforts that have taken place since then. So at the time, we didn't know how long the break would be until phase 5. We now know phase 5 is going to start on the 9th of April. And we also know that he's combined phase 5 and phase 6 together to avoid any unnecessarily delay. But he also goes into the reasons why it's necessary for the Post Office inquiry to be meticulous as they get into the truth, and why the breaks in between the phase of the inquiry are necessary to ensure the adequate and smooth running of the inquiry and ensure that they can do their job properly. So let's jump into the inquiry.
Very important part of my task is to ensure the chair is at the right height. Otherwise you won't see me, which may be a good thing. Before we ask the witness to be sworn, there's just a few things I'd like to say. So if you'd sit down for the moment, Mr. Bradshaw. First of all, I'd like to express the hope that those of you who are regular participants in the inquiry have had a good break and you are refreshed and ready for action, so to speak. Over the next 3 weeks, we will be finishing phase 4 of the inquiry, and it will finish with evidence from Mr. Bradshaw today, evidence from a number of employees and ex-employees of Fujitsu next week. And then following that, we will look at 1 or 2 of the cases in other parts of the United Kingdom, namely Northern Ireland and Scotland. And then we'll hear oral submissions from some of the core participants, no doubt, and receive written submissions from others. There'll then be a bit of a break. That, I'm afraid, is inevitable, because in between phases, my extremely hard-working inquiry team need to be prepared for the commencement of each phase, as, of course, do all the core participants. I wish I could tell you today precisely how long that break will be, but I can't do that, not least in part because it is dependent upon the disclosure issues carrying on smoothly. And as everyone will know, from time to time, we have hiccups about that. And I should remind everyone that in the phases to come, it is not just the Post Office who will have an important obligation in relation to disclosure, because we will be delving in the phases to come into the activities of government departments and civil servants and senior people of that kind. So there will be important disclosure to be made by government as well as Post Office. So that's why I can't be precise about the length of the break before the start of phases 5, 6, and 7. But you'll have seen on our website that we intend that those phases should be in the spring and summer of this year, and that is my hope. My wife was extremely alarmed to hear a news report yesterday that suggested that phase 6 would not start until the spring of next year. And I was under severe pressure over that, I can assure you. And it is certainly my intention that that phase starts long before the spring of next year. I am pleased to report that the inquiry has appointed an expert witness to deal with the governance issues. In fact, there are 2. It's Dame Sandra Dawson and Dr. Katie Stewart. They will be advising the inquiry in much the same way as Mr. Atkinson KC did over criminal and prosecution matters, and Mr. Scipione did about some of the technical aspects relating to Horizon. And they are now busily engaged in looking at all the relevant documents and preparing their evidence. So we're doing our best to comply with the, I won't say promise, but hope that I've always expressed, that we would proceed diligently and expeditiously and as quickly as reasonably practicable. But I've proved to be very bad at predicting these things, as you will all realize. But there it is. We have to do a thorough job, and in the end, doing a thorough job and hopefully getting it right is more important than a few months here or there. So thank you very much for listening to those opening remarks, and I'll now invite Mr. Bradshaw to be sworn and Mr. Blake to ask him questions.
So I thought it was important to cover that update there. So that was an update Sir Wyn gave on the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry on the 11th of January 2024, and it addresses some of the issues, because one of the common questions that asked is why is the inquiry taking so long? I think one of the key issues, which has certainly plagued Phase 4, but seemingly it has, plagued much of the inquiry, is the timely disclosure by organisations involved of evidence that has been requested. Now, obviously, some of this evidence is for a long time ago. It might well be difficult, and obviously we don't know the internal mechanisms in these organisations and how much of a priority it's seen, because obviously they've got to carry on their business as usual as well. Nevertheless, it does seem to be impeding the progress of the inquiry. We do now know, following the end of Phase 4 at the end of February, that actually Phase 5 and 6 have now been combined to avoid any unnecessary delay, and that will commence on the 9th of April 2024, followed by a short break in the summer again prior to the final phase, Phase 7, at which point Sir Wyn will be writing his final report, which I believe is potentially expected around January 2025. So I hope that gives a bit of an overview of some of the issues that were encountered in the midst of Phase 4. This was approximately 3/4 of the way through Phase 4, and also gives a bit of insight onto why the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry is taking so long. Obviously, there's a lot of evidence to deal with, a lot of witnesses to call, a lot of people to hear from, a lot of preparation necessary. And again, hopefully it answers that question that people have said, why does there need to be such long breaks in the inquiry? Well, essentially, witness statements have to be sought, they have to think about the questions they're going to answer, counsel has to prepare, and they have to get, necessary discussions with organisations around documents they need for certain witnesses. So that's one of the reasons why it can seem to be a bit frustrating and taking a bit longer than we might want it to at times, but why the work of the Post Office Horizon IT inquiry is so important to get into as close to the truth as is possible in terms of the really important issues that they are discussing. And it obviously does go without saying that, there has been some progress recently on convictions against sub-postmasters being overturned, but it is really important that the compensation for sub-postmasters proceeds without any unnecessary delay.